I'm Brad Thompson, and I have the distinct honor to be the director of the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon to our John W. Pope Lecture Series, and to help us celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Clemson Institute. Before we begin, I'd like to take this opportunity to publicly thank the Pope Foundation for its very generous support in funding today's lecture. And I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors for the lecture, the Institute for Humane Studies and the John Templeton Foundation. Before I introduce our distinguished speaker, I'd like to say a few things about the work of the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism. The Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism is Clemson's premier think tank dedicated to exploring philosophic ideas, and it is one of America's premier academic centers dedicated to exploring the philosophic foundations of a free society. I have three questions for the students that are here with us today. First, how many of you would like to take a course where you read the great texts of moral and political philosophy by authors such as Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Machiavelli, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Marx, Nietzsche, etc.? Second, how many of you would like to take a literature course where you actually read great plays by playwrights such as Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and Shakespeare, where you read great novels by authors such as Austen, Dickens, Eliot, Stendhal, Flaubert, Hawthorne, Twain, Melville, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and where you get to read great poetry by poets such as Homer, Goethe, and Tennyson? And finally, how many amongst the students here today would like to take courses with some of the smartest and most dynamic professors at Clemson University? If your answer is yes to any of these questions, I'd like to take a moment to recommend two courses that are being offered by Clemson Institute staff next semester. The first is Political Science 1030, Introduction to Political Theory. And Professor Brandon Turner and Dave Woodard from the Political Science Department will be teaching sections of that class in the fall. And the second class I'd like to recommend, as you are about to register for classes next semester, is Great Works 3010, which is Great Books of the Western World, which is being offered through the English department and is being taught by Professor Colin Pierce. These are going to be fantastic classes, and if you are a serious student interested in philosophy and literature, I would highly recommend that you register for these classes. As many of you know, free thought and expression are under assault on America's college campuses. And I would like to remind the students here with us today that the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism stands foursquare in defense of your freedom of thought and speech. As many of you know, last year, I took out a full-page ad in the Tiger co-signed by my two friends and colleagues, Professors Brad Meyer from the Physics Department and Alan Grubb from the History Department, both of whom are here with us today. And in light of the topic of today's lecture, I'd like to remind all of you what we wrote in our open letter to Clemson students. How many of you remember seeing these posters plastered over campus last semester? Let me see, a show of hands. How many of you remember seeing these? Yeah. Just very quickly, let me share with you a few of the ideas expressed in our open letter. We wrote, "We pledge to all Clemson students, present and future, that we support and will defend your freedom of thought, conscience, inquiry, speech, expression, and communication. It is our moral obligation as faculty to defend our students' basic rights to free speech and expression, whether we support those views or not. In the name of genuine tolerance and diversity, let there be no thought crimes or thought police at Clemson University. Our campus must be a refuge for free thought and speech, which includes ideas that we do not like or that make us feel uncomfortable. That's what a true university is and does. Let all Clemson faculty and students unite to fight error and prejudice with rational arguments, critical investigation, and unfettered debate, which requires upholding the principle of free speech uncompromisingly. We, therefore, pledge to you, the students of Clemson University, that we shall work tirelessly to fight censorship and to keep alive the spirit of open-minded inquiry at Clemson University. For the students here today, I want you to know one thing: we mean it. Now to the main event. I begin my introduction of our guest speaker by quoting from the book of Ecclesiasticus. Let us now praise famous men and our fathers that begat us. Our speaker today, Professor Alan Charles Kors, is Henry Charles Lee Professor of History at the University of Pennsylvania, where he has taught remarkably, unbelievably, for the past 48 years. Professor Kors received his BA from Princeton and his PhD at Harvard, and he began teaching at Penn at the ripe old age of 24. Professor Kors is one of America's leading intellectual historians of modern Europe. He is the author of several important books, including D'Holbach's Coterie and Enlightenment in Paris and Atheism in France, 1650 to 1729. He was also the editor-in-chief of the 4-volume Encyclopedia of the Enlightenment published by Oxford University Press. This summer, he will publish 2 books with Cambridge University Press: Naturalism and Unbelief in France, 1650 to 1729, and Epicureans and Atheists in France, 1650 to 1729. In addition to Professor Kors's great intellectual accomplishments, he is also a man of extraordinary courage and integrity. He is, I think it is true to say, America's leading proponent of free speech and its greatest opponent of political correctness. To that end, he co-authored in 1998 The Shadow University, The Betrayal of Liberty on American Campuses, which is one of the most important books ever written defending the marketplace of ideas on America's college campuses. He was also the co-founder of FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, America's premier organization defending freedom of thought and speech on America's college campuses. Professor Kors is also the recipient of many awards, including the National Humanities Medal and the Bradley Prize for his distinguished scholarly work and for his defense of academic freedom. Alan Kors has spent his entire academic career fighting to keep alive what Robert Hutchins once referred to as the great conversation that should be at the heart of every university education. And a proper liberal arts education should always hold before us what Alfred North Whitehead once called the habitual vision of greatness. For many scholars of my generation, Professor Kors has embodied that vision of greatness. Not only is he a brilliant scholar, but he is a man who embodies all of the classical virtues: wisdom, justice, fortitude, and temperance. But most of all, he is a man of extraordinary integrity. And if integrity is the principle of being principled, then Alan Kors has it in spades. Today, Professor Kors will speak on the betrayal of liberty on American campuses. Ladies and gentlemen, it is with great pleasure that I introduce Professor Alan Charles Kors.
That was a joke. Okay. And already I can tell you I'm going to hire Professor Thompson to deliver my eulogy. I shall pre-book him. It's a great privilege and pleasure to be here, and I'm grateful for you. And asked if I needed any audio-visual high-tech. I said all I want is water and an audience of open minds. I've got the water, and I hope you will supply the open minds. The student radicals of the late 1960s and early 70s claimed that they wanted liberty, free speech, freedom of association, freedom of conscience, freedom to define themselves. They did want those things, but it turns out they wanted them not as ends and values in themselves, but as a means to advance their partisan and political agenda. They secured those things for themselves, destroying most of the in loco parentis functions of the university, universities standing in the place of parents. The students who followed them, however, did not look up to the aging heirs of the 60s as gurus or as moral and political leaders. Indeed, these new students often made fun of the 60s, recoiled from its styles, and in a majority in 1984, even voted for Ronald Reagan. For the heirs of the 60s, those new students had to be saved from themselves and from American society. And freedom for students was the first thing to be sacrificed to that political agenda. Now, if you follow the news on our campuses, one finds students themselves eager to eviscerate and sacrifice the liberties of their fellow students. Campus radicals and zealots have changed their motto from the 1960s mantra of "don't trust anyone over 30, that truly was one of the most common slogans one heard, to "don't trust anyone under 30, unless it is we zealots under 30 who agree with you." They have given up on the notion that students are young adults, and they have institutionalized their views in the in loco parentis role of universities, making their own particular ideological analysis of America and oppression not a voice on campus, but the official secular religion of academic life. Here is what they believe, and if you understand this, you can understand what is happening, or most of what is happening, to our colleges and universities. They believe that most undergraduates are intellectual and political children who enter universities inadequately aware of the effects of American, and here's the trilogy, racism, sexism, and heterosexism, and its source, capitalism, on them and on America's victims. They believe, and it is a patronizing perspective almost unchallenged in academic life, that most Americans who are themselves so-called minorities, and each of us, of course, in fact, is a minority of one, blacks, Hispanics, gays and lesbians, students of Asian descent, and though in fact they are a majority on campus, women, do not adequately understand the nature and methods of their oppression, and indeed often have internalized the very values by which society oppresses them. Leninists labeled this phenomenon of judging from the perspective of your oppressors false consciousness. What could workers possibly know compared to intellectuals about what workers authentically wanted? And their murderous contempt for those with false consciousness drowned the world in blood. Today's more benign facilitators of diversity and multicultural education at hundreds of colleges and universities, and hide anyone you love whenever you hear the word facilitator or trainer in matters of the mind and the spirit. They label it internalized oppression, and they identify it most easily by any tendency to reject, resist, or question, surprise, the facilitator's view of reality. Now, countless courses in the official curriculum undertake to enlighten students about the unjust ways of their society of greed. Indeed, it would clarify universities greatly if they simply created schools of oppression studies, distinct from schools of the arts and sciences, where one might study surveys of oppression, the history of the West, theories of oppression, somewhat paradoxically left-wing Western thought, and area studies of oppression, free markets and oppression, and special topic seminars in one's senior year, for example, on the unspeakable oppression of Ivy League women. For the self-designated progressives, however, despite the profusion of such courses in the curriculum, that is not enough. Too many students remain independent and critical in their thought and values. Most so-called minorities deeply reject any truly radical politics, wanting above all else their just share of American legal equality and opportunity and bounty. Most whites just do not feel guilty about their births. And men and women, far from perceiving each other as class enemies, continue to fall in love, write each other poetry, if not far, far worse. That's a joke, too. Thus, the full weight of administrative authority must be brought to bear over students' extracurricular and private lives in order to give politically correct moral enlightenment and inspiration to undergraduates. The children of the 60s in the 60s had put the question this way: what could our elders possibly know, being the product of a wicked America? The children of the 60s, now elders, put the question a bit differently now. What do our children possibly know, being the product of a wicked America? Sadly, indeed tragically, more and more students are demanding that their fellow students be treated precisely as children. Thus, we have moved at more and more campuses from their free speech movement to their speech codes, from their own struggle against mandatory religious chapel to their own struggle for mandatory diversity education and sensitivity seminars, from their freedom to smoke pot openly on college lawns to their outlawing of kegs of beer in the ongoing war against disinhibited hormones, above all, testosterone. American students are the victims of a generational swindle of truly epic proportions. And sadly, far too many students are all in support of that swindle. A few practices and policies stand out on our campuses today. First, so-called diversity and multicultural education. These programs are marked everywhere by the most shallow and partisan definitions and notions of diversity. In theory, and as presented to the public, multiculturalism will invite the deep study and appreciation of a diversity of human cultures. In fact, however, the primary true meaning of multiculturalism is quite different. It does mean precisely the following. There is one dominant culture in the West, Greek, Judeo-Christian, and Enlightenment and in its sources, and forget about the excitement of debates among and within those traditions. That one Western culture is the enemy of authentic debate, human freedom, and altruism everywhere. Capitalistic, sexist, racist, and Eurocentric, spreading ignorance, injustice, despotic power, and poverty everywhere. That must be why people flee the West and why no one wants in. One hegemonic culture. Any voices that challenge it, and only those voices that challenge it, are multicultural. That is why black radicals are multicultural, but black libertarians or conservatives are not. And indeed, why whites who silence a black conservative or libertarian commits a multicultural act. That is why the Central and South American Marxists are multicultural, but the Cuban entrepreneurs of Dade County are not. The so-called multiculturalists do not and have never meant the study and appreciation of evangelical Protestant culture, of traditionalist Catholic culture, of Black American Pentecostal culture, or indeed of the place of faith in Black and Hispanic American life, let alone the gender roles of Orthodox Jewish culture. They do not mean the study and appreciation of any assimilationist immigrant culture or of white Southern rural cultures. They also do not mean the serious study of West African Benin culture or the serious study of Confucian culture, both requiring linguistic accomplishment and rigorous inquiry to achieve understanding. All they mean is the appreciation, celebration, and deep study of those intellectuals who think exactly the way that they do about the nature and causes of oppression wherever they are found, or however non-representative those thinkers are of the broader groups they allegedly represent and speak for. Further, their view is a humanly and morally impoverished notion of diversity, race, sex, and sexuality, as if each of these had one appropriate worldview and voice, but not religion, class, psychological type, taste, or private passions and moral commitments. In terms of what is, in fact, a far more significant diversity on our campuses, students, on the one hand, who affirm life, and on the other, students who are fearful, depressed, and fatalistic. The universities exhibiting a deep racialism and misogyny themselves assume that ego strength correlates to externalities, and that whites, Christian men, and heterosexuals have it, whereas blacks, women, and gays do not. So while Christian students are asked to bear any number of affronts to their beliefs in the name of academic freedom, as is proper, a woman or black on our campuses must be protected from the punchline of a joke, as if women and blacks were too weak to live with freedom or with the Bill of Rights. If you come to any moral conclusion from anything I say, let it be this: no one who tells you that you are too weak to live with freedom is your friend. To reach their conclusions, one must deny the reality of individual human lives. In such a denial of our humanity, a white student whose mother or father committed suicide the summer before college began, or whose cancer is in temporary remission, is deemed strong by blood, while the wealthy son or daughter, happy in life, of two successful so-called minority professionals has the right to tell him or her to, as the current phrase has it, check his white privilege at the door. This is identity by blood. This is racialist fascism, in my view, not the human decency of recognition of the complexity of real human lives. The deeper question, though, is why not universities of free individuals who define themselves? Universities do not want that kind of diversity because their agendas are purely political and based upon group, not individual identity. Which brings me to the crime for which this generation truly will have to answer before history of officially designated group identities. I am not talking about people who choose voluntarily to associate on the basis of race, gender, sexuality, around a common political or cultural agenda. I am talking about the crime of assigning identities to human beings as they enter a university. At the intellectual level, current notions of group identity are crude and laughable. Universities speak of white, European, Eurocentric as single cultural phenomena, linking all those look-alike, think-alike Finns and Sicilians, French atheists and Eastern Orthodox Slavs, Basques and Iowans, Southern Baptists and Orthodox Jewish New Yorkers into one identity. There's a deep analysis worthy of our institutions of higher education. As George Orwell once wrote, there are some ideas so wrong that only a very intelligent person could believe in them, close quote. In practice, the assignment of official group identity by universities has been a dysfunctional approach that has worsened, not bettered, human relations at campuses, creating barriers and defensiveness and failing to take advantage of the open spirit with which most undergraduates enter a university. Our campuses each year become ever more segregated and ever more balkanized. Morally, the mania of official group identity has denied the only authentic meaning of liberation, the right to individuate by one's own lights, free of external coercions and impositions. It has intruded upon the sanctity of self-definition and private conscience. Trading in one set of masters over your individual identity for another set of masters is not, to say the least, liberation. It is the right of all free men and women to decide for themselves the meaning and importance or relative unimportance of their race, ethnicity, religion, sex, and sexuality. No one has the moral right to decide that for you and to assign you official voices. Racial profiling is despicable, whether it comes from police or from the university in loco parentis, because it denies the individuality at the heart of human dignity. But we thus on our campuses have women's centers and multicultural centers on so many campuses that operationally distinguish between, on the one hand, real women and real blacks with appropriate radical consciousness, their vital constituency, and on the other, somehow, ersatz, fake, artificial women and blacks who have, quote, internalized their oppression, close quote. It is tyrannical, it is evil, it is maladaptive, it is dumb, and it is the source of endless administrative jobs on our campuses. It is a disgrace. Now, power, especially power of such magnitude, needs to demonstrate that it controls the symbolic and the judicial environment, which brings me to speech codes, or because so few have the courage to call them that, the verbal behavior or verbal conduct provisions of our harassment and Title IX codes. In what should be a national scandal, given the crucial importance to America of an education in freedom, universities are the scene of a ferocious assault upon free speech. There now are hundreds and hundreds of colleges and universities that have restricted the free speech rights of their students and faculties. At public universities, even when unchallenged, such codes are manifestly unconstitutional, and every court decision involving a public university has reached that conclusion. At private universities, they are generally unadvertised. Of course, of crucial importance, a private voluntary association may adopt whatever rules within the law it chooses. There is nothing to prevent a private association, a private university in this case, to decide that regulation of speech openly advertised and voluntarily chosen by students and faculty in attending is essential to fulfill a religious or secular sectarian role. It is part of American pluralism that we may have Catholic seminaries or neo-Marxist institutes that are free to privilege a particular orthodoxy and to punish as advertised to the world particular heresies or statements. If one attends Bob Jones University, or indeed Swarthmore College, it is with consciousness of the product offered. Bob Jones presents itself in terms of its religious goals. Swarthmore openly states that it believes consensus and community values to be more important than individual rights. No one goes to Brigham Young University and only discovers that it is Mormon after the school has cashed your tuition check. Most universities, however, promise academic freedom, but deliver selective oppression and censorship. Most promise non-discrimination on the basis of race, sex, and sexuality, but then extend rights and programs differentially, precisely on such grounds. We have names for that in civil society: fraud, false advertising, and breach of contract. To the learned, it is given to be learnedly absurd, and speech codes illustrate that truth painfully. When I began fighting speech codes on our campuses in the 1980s, here is what I discovered then. Bowdoin College banned jokes and stories, quote, experienced by others as harassing, close quote. Well, that certainly is clear. Now you know what you may or may not say. Brown University banned, quote, verbal behavior that produces feelings of impotence, anger, or disenfranchisement, whether intentional or unintentional, close quote. Now that code produced feelings of impotence, anger, and disenfranchisement in me. But that was not, as you might imagine, quite what they had in mind. Colby College outlawed speech that causes, quote, a vague sense of danger, direct quote, a vague sense of danger or a loss of self-esteem, close quote. Now, I have read some reviews of my scholarly works that have caused me a great loss of self-esteem. It never occurred to me I had the right to seek redress under harassment law. The University of Connecticut, watch your joke slip away with this. The University of Connecticut outlawed, quote, inconsiderate jokes, close quote. Quote, stereotyping, close, and even, quote, inappropriately directed laughter. Indeed, laughing at a politically incorrect joke could get you brought up on charges and did, in fact, get people brought up on charges. The University of Buffalo Law School limited student free speech by, quote, the responsibility to promote equality and justice. Now, substitute spirituality or patriotism for equality and justice, and imagine the outrage. Syracuse University outlawed, quote, offensive remarks, sexually suggestive staring, and sexual, sexist, or heterosexist remarks or jokes, close quote. The University of Maryland criminalized, quote, idle chatter of a sexual nature, pseudo-medical advice about sex, presumably you know what you need, and this is direct quote, holding or eating food provocatively, close quote. If you intend to eat melon or a banana, folks, take your lawyer to the cafeteria. West Virginia University outlawed all of these, word for word, but further instructed incoming students and new faculty that they must, quote, use language that is not gender specific. Instead of referring to anyone's romantic partner as girlfriend or boyfriend, use positive generic terms such as friend, lover, or partner, close quote. If I ever said of my wife, I'd like you to meet my friend Erica, I'd be in a whole lot of trouble. The University of North Dakota criminalized as harassment anything that intentionally produces, quote, psychological discomfort, embarrassment, or ridicule, close quote, a category of no small scope. Neither Richard Pryor nor Jon Stewart, I guarantee you, right, could have passed that test in North Dakota. Now, if you found any of these grotesque, try this one on from the Clemson University Anti-Harassment and Non-Discrimination Policy, promulgated on October 14, 2015, and governing your rights as students and faculty on this campus. In fact, I probably should have requested a waiver from your President, Title IX officer, and Office of General Counsel before beginning my talk. They don't believe that you on campus are mature or moral enough to live with the same rights granted by the Constitution to the Gamecocks, bound by the Constitution. And I probably shouldn't use that word either. Gamecocks, not Constitution, right? But I wouldn't mind defending myself or any of you from the clutches that arise from this policy. Here is what governs you. Section 2, definitions, subsection B, harassment. Quote, in general, harassment is unwelcome verbal or physical conduct. Incidentally, how do you know that verbal conduct is unwelcome until someone says to you, that's unwelcome, right? It's a remarkable notion, but it's a great weapon to put into some people's hands. Unwelcome verbal or physical contact based upon race, color, religion, sex, sexual orientation, gender, pregnancy, national origin, age, disability, status as a military veteran, genetic information, or protected activity, e.g. opposition to prohibited discrimination or participation in the statutory complaint process that unreasonably interferes with a person's work or educational performance or creates an intimidating or hostile work or education environment, close quote. And this is boilerplate language. You'll find it on hundreds of campuses. But let's condense that a bit, stressing what is prohibited. Harassment is unwelcome verbal conduct based upon race, color, religion, sex, sexual orientation, age, or status as a military veteran that creates a hostile work environment. So what do you think if a sincere radical calls a Vietnam vet professor a baby killer? Will Clemson pursue a harassment case? If a black militant calls a white conservative an ignorant bastard, will Clemson pursue a harassment case? If a Clemson feminist calls a Christian evangelical student a born-again bigot, will Clemson pursue a harassment case? Ladies and gentlemen, don't hold your breaths. It's not only a disgraceful policy, it's a weapon meant to be used in only one partisan direction. Substantively, speech codes create a barrier to that freedom in which an education worthy of free men and women alone can occur. Debate, disagreements, speaking about what others would deem unthinkable, the right to heterodoxy and eccentricity and passions. They deny things that should be self-evident, the indispensability of freedom to learning, the dignity and strength of meeting speech that one abhors with further speech, with reason, with evidence, with cold contempt, or with moral outrage and moral witness. Prejudice, bigotry, and ignorance do not disappear when their expression is suppressed. Rather, they simply go deeper into people's souls, and no one has the chance to know how other people think and to respond in appropriate form. Sunlight, as Supreme Court Justice Brandeis correctly observed, sunlight is the best disinfectant. Above all, speech codes deny your liberty, and they reveal the brazen hypocrisy of the heirs of the 60s on our campuses. Listen to the words of the anthem of the free speech movement of the 1960s. Phil Oakes's "I'm Gonna Say It Now." Quote, "Oh, you'd like to be my father, and you'd like to be my dad, and give me kisses when I'm good, and spank me when I'm bad. But since I've left my parents, I've forgotten how to bow. So when I've got something to say, sir, I'm gonna say it now." Close quote. The same admirers of the 60s who thrilled to that song are imposing speech codes on students whom they openly refer to as, quote, just children. And now some of those students join in the call for their own infantilization. It is a new standard of bad faith. Speech codes are inherently illiberal, but they become insufferable in virtue of their intended and systemic double standards in practice, without which they could not last for a nanosecond. You can use that term in an engineering school, see? Their proponents talk about civility, but they do not care a whit about civility. And indeed, they are the most uncivil individuals whom I know. Rather, they believe that universities should be at the forefront of reassigning rights unequally in order to redress historical wrongs. Speech codes create an arena of double standards, arbitrary partisan enforcement, and the raw use of power to enforce a political agenda. Thus, you may say virtually anything you wish against Christian or traditionalists or fraternity students. You know that. When it comes to the free speech of so-called progressives, universities proclaim that passions are an essential part of freedom of expression, as are slurs, let alone jokes. But how then ask for civility to protect progressive groups from the passions of others? Has anyone ever been found guilty of harassing an evangelical, a libertarian, or a Republican? On the one hand, thus, every university has its catalog of epithets whose utterance would go beyond the pale, even in a case in which I defended a student, water buffalo. On the other hand, Mapplethorpe's homoerotic photographs, including one of a black man urinating into the mouth of a white man, widely shown on American campuses. And Andres Serrano's, his title, Piss Christ, a crucifix immersed in the artist's urine. They become the sacred icons of the First Amendment, even unto the issue of taxpayer funding. reverse the races in Mapplethorpe's, when I don't know how to pronounce his name, I'll do it Maple one time, Mapple the next. Reverse the races in Mapplethorpe's urination photograph, or immerse a portrait of Martin Luther King or the feminist icon Gloria Steinem in urine, and the university would close for days of conscience. Heads would roll. Sensitivity training would become mandatory. On my campus, there would be an annual week of shame on the campus calendar in perpetuity. But indeed, the most common terms of racial abuse on our campuses are not the crude epithets of the Ku Klux Klan, but the hurtful and hateful terms, Uncle Tom or Oreo, black on the outside, white on the inside, or banana, West Coast, yellow on the outside, white on the inside, directed against blacks or Asian Americans who have chosen to have white friends among their objects of love or affection. No one, however, ever has been prosecuted for those hostile terms. The feelings of moderate, religious, or assimilationist students are given no standing whatsoever in the alleged sensitivity to pain underlying protection from free speech and free expression. You may call any evangelical a Jesus freak or born-again bigot, any veteran a baby killer, any black with white friends an Uncle Tom, any female critic of feminism a Barbie doll. I have heard from hundreds of male students around this country who tell me that in the feminist classroom they have been told that they think with their penises. I put the phrase politely. If I said the equivalent of that to a female student, they would escort me off the campus under armed guard as a clear and present danger to my students. They would ban me from the campus. They would begin immediately proceedings for my termination. But education, to be edifying in a free society, must occur in conditions of liberty of expression and the great dream of reform in America, equality before the law. Neither exists on most campuses today. It also must occur in conditions of respect for privacy and for conscience, which brings me to my next theme, the rise of residential social engineering. Increasingly in today's universities, offices of student life, including those who govern freshman orientations, residence advisors, residential programming, and judicial systems, have moved from being service providers to being self-proclaimed progressive social workers whose mission is to bring the benighted children of America into the enlightenment of partisan political awareness. They have substituted a politically therapeutic university for a critical educational university. Hundreds of universities have ideological litmus tests for residential and student life positions. Hundreds have transformed their freshman orientations and residential programming into a combination of intrusive therapy and political boot camps. In recruiting the thought police and social engineers of offices of student life and residence, universities have hung out not welcome signs for all those who dissent from their political ideology. Further, hidden behind the veil of confidentiality of judicial proceedings, a large number of charges of politically incorrect crimes are adjudicated by a settlement, an academic plea bargain, in which the frightened respondent, as an alternative to potentially crushing life-changing penalties, agrees confidentially to undergo intrusive and partisan sensitivity training on matters of race, gender, or sexual preference. Such sensitivity training is nothing less than thought reform more appropriate to the University of Beijing during the Cultural Revolution than to the universities of a free society. What are the alternatives? My own experience of the 60s, which occurred in the early 70s, involved the founding of Van Pelt College House at the University of Pennsylvania, an educational residence with a reputation as a good place to be, whoever you were, with no social work, and certainly, to say the very least, no speech codes. I was a faculty fellow there. This happened. We attracted and had living together students across the entire spectrum of different backgrounds and perspectives. We had gay rights activists and the leadership of Campus Crusade for Christ. We had radical feminists and the pro-life board of the Catholic Newman Center. We had black conservatives, there is Wharton Business School at Penn. We had black conservatives and black radicals. We had college Republicans and Maoist revolutionaries. Because we had a great reputation as a place to be an individual and not to have to live as a representative of a group, at a time Penn was 2 to 3% black, Van Pelt, after its first year, was never, for the 7 further years I lived there, less than 20% black. We lived the spontaneous discovery of difference, which was categorically distinct from the coerced and artificial imposition of mandatory appreciation of difference. We moved from insults to conversation, from hostilities to various degrees of understanding, from mutual demonization to decent relationships. People offended each other all the time, but then they learned to talk to each other, and far more often than today's totalitarians ever could imagine, to understand each other. My name even changed from Hey Fascist to Allen. What price are we paying by denying students that experience in this 21st century? Students do not choose universities to be their mother and father, let alone an intrusive set of therapists, let alone a political police enforcing restrictive rules governing voluntary relationships outside the classroom. We must anathematize every university that without truth in advertising seeks groupthink, unequal rights, the invasion of private conscience, and the chilling of debate and expression. Let them have the courage, if they truly believe what they say privately to themselves and to me, to put it on page 1 of their catalog, their fundraising letters, their appeals to the State Assembly. Quote, "This university believes that your sons and daughters are the racist, sexist, homophobic, European progeny or victims of an oppressive society from which most of them receive unjust privilege. In return for massive tuition and massive taxpayer subsidy, we shall assign rights on a compensatory basis and undertake by coercion their moral and political enlightenment." Close quote. Let them have the guts to advertise themselves honestly, and then let's see who pays the bills. History, for better or worse, has made us all actors in this context. And both charity and rights join hands here, because the more that universities coerce and socially engineer human relations at the university, the worse, not the better, things become. Our multiculturalism, increasingly defined tribally, has become the multiculturalism of the Yugoslavian civil wars. We welcome our first-year classes not as equal individuals into a community of inquiry, but as historical and genetic embodiments of group identities, and then we wonder why they have difficulty in overcoming their differences. 70 years after the defeat of Nazism, we distinguish by blood, and we equate blood with culture. 80 years after the Nazis' Nuremberg race laws, we ask our students on form after form either to check off their bloodlines, or if they are the children of mixed marriages, either to choose one parent while denying the other, or to describe themselves, this truly is the term on so many forms, as other. Can it last? America patiently has subsidized critics who have the utmost contempt for its values of individual liberty and individual rights, but it is an utterly absurd supposition that the victims of partisan codes, intrusion of conscience, lack of due process, and selective, biased enforcement of regulations will acquiesce indefinitely in the double standards upon which their campus legal inequality depends. There will be a day of reckoning, but when it comes, God help us, because where will one then find a broad coalition already formed around the love of liberty, due process, and legal equality? Where will all our self-proclaimed progressive academics find shelter when those winds blow against them, after they themselves have attempted to convince everyone who passes through their portals that liberty and legal equality are wholly tactical and dispensable? In conclusion, in Robert Bolt's magnificent play, A Man for All Seasons, Richard Rich, after his perjured testimony that would send Thomas More to the executioner, passed by the defendant's dock. More noticed a new chain of office around Rich's neck. Richard Rich was now Solicitor General for Wales. Looking at Rich, the stage directions tell us, with a mixture of pain and amusement, More said, quote, "For Wales? Why, Richard, it profits a man nothing to give his soul for the whole world. But for Wales? Indeed, for tenure or promotion, for a grade, for fame as an educational philanthropist, for shelter from partisan charges, for peace and quiet. Universities so desperately need, within and without, what they do not have. Men and women for all seasons, who bear witness to beliefs antithetical to the new tyrannies, who bear witness to the universalism of legal equality over the crude official divisions of race, gender, and sexuality, to the sacred right of self-definition by the lights of one's own conscience, to individual liberty and responsibility over the group politics of victimization or guilt, entitlement, or debts owed. It is above all else our liberty and legal equality that define us in this world as human beings with dignity, capable of morals. The struggle for that freedom at universities is one of the defining struggles of the age in which we find ourselves. Please recognize and join that struggle with rigor, vigilance, will, tolerance, and courage. There truly are no sidelines. Thank you very much. Thank you. That is not my normal reception. Thank you.
Well, that was truly a remarkable speech. And Professor Kors has agreed to stay on for another 20 minutes or so to take questions. It is our tradition at the Clemson Institute to take the first 2 or 3 questions from students. So if there are students, we have microphones down here at the front. Please come on down, and Professor Kors will be happy to take your question.
Ready? Oh. Hey, thank you for coming. My question's kind of long. So in 2013, Washington State's governor signed into law a bill replacing all gender-specific wording with neutral terms, such as replacing the word fisherman to fisher and penmanship to handwriting, citing the argument that these gender-specific terms in the English language perpetuate an offensive gender binary. That being said, Clemson University was an all-male institution until 1955, and it has a 20-line alma mater that includes the words sons, brothers, and manhood. So my question, to what extent would you support replacing or banning altogether gender-specific language on campus?
This, by the way, is a problem faced by an extraordinary number of schools that had been all males and whose alma maters indeed are sex-specific in the way that in precisely the way that you mentioned. Look, I think that language and institutions evolve spontaneously. That one reaches points, especially at a place of education such as a university, where spontaneously and naturally, without diktat, without a committee telling you how you should talk, where people spontaneously change their phrasing, their language, right? There are people my age caught on a terrible linguistic divide, right? A waitress walks up at a cafeteria and they say, well, darling, or well, honey, and they're in trouble, right? They've got students with them, or indeed if the waitress is a student. But that changes over time, right? There is something called spontaneous development, spontaneous evolution. And I think that adult human beings are capable of evolving their own sense of appropriate and inappropriate language without official diktat, without someone coercively imposing upon them what can and what cannot be said. And indeed, given the rebelliousness of college students, everyone older than they are is authority. Tell people, tell people at a prep school you can't smoke, and there they are out behind the buildings at night. If you really want to bring offensive speech into being, or even inappropriate speech, or even we could do better and be more inclusive in our speech. So I suspect that students at Clemson, without great difficulty, it certainly happened at Princeton also, when I was there, it was all male. My daughter went there, it was co-ed, and sure enough, the alma mater had changed, and it hadn't been imposed. Reasonable people had gotten together and found this is now anachronistic, this belongs to a different age. I would trust what people do in a condition of freedom. Not only is it more substantial, but it has a moral value that bowing to dictates does not have. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
I've already let you know you can be hostile, offensive, right? Slurs. So please, if you've disagreed, please feel free, more than free, to articulate your views.
So let's take a question from one more student. Surely there's a student here who's ready and willing to ask a question. And then we'll open the floor up to the entire audience. Gentleman in the back, do you want to come down to the microphone, please?
Okay. This is a little bit not as political question. How did you not get fired? How did they never find you out? You violated the code.
Right. No, that's actually an interesting question. What I have become at the University of Pennsylvania is the token believer in liberty from these perspectives that allows people to say, you think I'm a political bigot? Why, Alan Kors is one of my best friends. Or you think this department is bigoted, right, and politically intolerant? Alan Kors is one of our professors. I would never get hired now. But once there, and once they were stuck with me, they turned it into a virtue on their part. And I am everyone's token of their political pluralism and tolerance. Kind of interesting.
Well, it's good to see you have survived.
Thank you. They haven't paid me well, but I've survived.
Thank you very, very much
Thank you.
for not only your ideology, but the eloquence of your presentation.
Oh, you're very kind.
I would like to know, and it's a refreshing breath in polluted air, but I'd like to know your opinion of how this thought, this ideology that you express, is progressing nationwide.
My point of view, I think my point of view is receding. I thought that I had done some real good in terms of speech codes, but Mark Twain once wrote that the only drive stronger in human beings than the sex drive is the drive to censorship. And it is a tide that is always coming in. So you can defend students here or there. You can get universities to eliminate the most publicly embarrassing parts of their codes. But it is, in fact, I think, after a brief period of embarrassment, returning with a vengeance political correctness on our college campuses. And it now also, political correctness has extraordinary financial and legal power through regulations that should have gone through administrative law, but that didn't, that were issued as clarifications of Title IX, prohibiting discrimination against women, by the Office for Civil Rights of the Department of Education, which ordered every university that receives federal funding to take certain steps against sexual harassment. One of those, which every university receiving federal funds must do, is lower the burden of proof in charges of sexual assault and rape on campus from clear and convincing evidence, let alone beyond a reasonable doubt, from clear and convincing evidence to preponderance of evidence. So 50.00001%. It also called for the training of panels that heard cases of sexual assault, and verbal assault can be part of this, of sexual assault, to be specially trained, and all of that training is done by radical feminist perspectives. And if the Stanford program was leaked and made public, in which the panels that were going to try cases that could have a young man expelled for rape on a campus, right? For sexual assault and rape on his transcript, end of his life, on the basis of a trained panel that had been told that women never lie about this.
What?
And that women don't lie about sexual assault. And that men are very clever in providing defenses. The Stanford program that leaked was just astonishing. And it has emboldened the whole political correctness movement on our campuses. They have stripped due process. So you have student after student, if you want to see it on a nonpartisan site that collects this data, including speech codes, including Clemson, thefire.org, THEFIRE, thefire.org. This is like my lectures in 17th century intellectual history, say something remarkable and no one's writing it down. But thefire.org collects violations of students' free speech rights, due process rights, what's happening in cases where a police force very sympathetic to women's rights will say there's no case to prosecute here, and a university will expel. That has emboldened. And universities have been told by the federal government if they wish to receive federal funds, which is life and death for all universities. If they wish to receive federal funds, they must take constructive steps to eliminate what are deemed to be the causes of abusive cultures on campuses, which means thought reform, which means changing the way people think, which means, among other things, getting freshmen on their first day of campus and letting them know, wouldn't you like to know this before you applied, that, 1 in 5 women on this campus are the victims of sexual assault, which is an absurd statistic, an absolutely absurd statistic. Those statistics, by the way, were gathered by classification by the person doing the survey. So you had women who said, no, I was not assaulted. I was not raped. But the question that they're asked is, have you ever had too much to drink and woken up the next morning and regretted that you slept with whom you slept with? And if the student said yes, I suspect a significant number of male students would answer that question yes. If the student answered yes, it was cataloged under rape. And if you must take constructive steps to eliminate the culture that produces it, then you've got to get to speech, and you've got to get to minds, and you've got to get to conscience, and you can do it coercively, even if it's a gentle totalitarianism, such as at most campuses. I know nothing about Clemson's program, if it's done in freshman orientation, which is one of the most common places for political indoctrination on most campuses. I don't know what the circumstance is at Clemson with that.
I take a little more positive view of that. I am consistently astounded at the scope, size, and number of organizations such as FIRE and others that are doing fine work.
Well, that's extremely kind and generous. I must say, there are times I feel like King Canute standing at the shore and telling the tide not to come in. But thank you very much.
I'm looking forward to a sea change come November.
I would love, I won't get into November.
Hi, how you doing, sir?
Hi there.
I've actually been aware of these policies for some time now. I've been working with FIRE, with Azhar Mayeed, one of the directors. Mm-hmm. And we've had limited success here trying to reform some of these policies with Young Americans for Liberty, Young Americans for Freedom, and Turning Point USA. My question to you is, what are the effective methods you've seen on other college campuses to reform policies like these?
There are three things that seem effective. Three. One, the way I look at repressive policies on campus. And it's the payoff in what I'm about to say in this case that gives you a strategy. is sexuality trumps neutrality. Race trumps sexuality. Gender trumps race, and careerism trumps everything. What universities live in terror of is being publicly embarrassed and publicly ridiculed. And the great successes I have had in defending students and in changing policies at a reasonable number of universities has been to say to administrators, this will go public, and this is the way we're going to frame it, so you know. And there now have been enough people publicly embarrassed and humiliated as administrators when their behaviors and their hypocrisies are brought to light. So one scandal, I mean, for example, how did I get Penn to change its freshman orientation? I wrote a letter to the president and provost, and I said, the social science underlying your claim that 1 in 5 women are raped, is raped at Penn, is absurd social science. But if you believe it, let's make it public, right? Let's take it public. It is the belief of this administration that 1 in 5 women on this campus will be raped. I said, just, put it out in your recruiting letters. I said, if you don't, I'll take it public. I'll say, Penn wants you to know, right? Because you're communicating it to students that if you send your daughter here, there's a 20% chance she'll get raped. Is there any place you would send a child where you believe there was a 20% chance of getting raped? So public exposure, I mean, that's in some ways the most powerful. The second is you have got to build coalitions. Liberty and due process are not partisan values. Liberty and due process and freedom of speech are core American values. And the crime, the shadows over American history have been the denial of those fundamental rights to all Americans. What America needed to do was to bring blacks and women into the sunshine of equal protection, of enforced equal rights, of enforced due process, of the rule of law, of legal equality, and you can build coalitions. Find those people on the other side of the political spectrum, from Young Americans for Freedom, for example, or the Young Americas Foundation on your campus, who believe in those values. And there's an argument everyone understands. Power changes hands, right? In one generation, it's going to be this group telling that group they don't have equal rights, right? Or we'll be firing Marxist professors in the 1950s. It really is true. Where will they stand when those winds blow from a different direction? And people understand that, and students understand that their infantilization is not a step toward dignity, that they're being denied rights that the Constitution gives to students at a county community college, that they're being denied those rights of the First Amendment here on a campus is not a step toward dignity. It's precisely a step toward second-class status and infantilization. So you have got to build coalitions. And 3, you've got to make the analogy. The problem is they have codes that they cannot enforce without a double standard. The first day that a feminist professor were told she should attend Christian sensitivity seminars, religious sensitivity seminars, because what she said made evangelical students feel unsafe, right? The whole system would collapse. All you need is legal equality, so give them the analogies, right? Say, for example, on the can you give consent if you've had 2 drinks, right? Ask them. So if I show up on a Sunday morning and say, I never would have had intimate relations with her, but she gave me 2 margaritas, and I want to file sexual assault and rape charges. They won't, right? They can't do it. So create the analogy, right? Just change the words and the examples that they give. And undergraduates will see it. And if you've got undergraduates on your side, if you can build a coalition, which is very important, build a coalition, and if you can threaten universities and administrations with public exposure of their hypocrisy, their double standards, and their tyranny, then you can change things.
Yes, sir, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Folks, just one thing before we end today. One of our co-sponsors, the Institute for Humane Studies, would like you, if you don't mind, to fill out these little surveys that they've left. I think everybody should have one either when they came in or on their seat. But if you wouldn't mind please filling out the survey, they and we would be appreciative. And you could leave them at the door there. We've got someone, Bettina, standing at the door. Bettina, put your hand up. Thank you. She's happy to take your surveys. And I want to end by thanking all of you for coming out today. Deeply appreciative. We will let you know when we have our next big lecture in the fall. And finally, I would ask all of you please to join me in doing a very, very rousing tiger. Thank you, Professor Allen.